I teach at Berkeley and run the Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society. Before going to Berkeley, I was the founding director of the Kerwin Institute at Ohio State, the Ohio State, for those of you who really know the real deal. We were given the opportunity to be involved in this case in terms of helping to think about the remedy. And I want to say a little bit about that in a few minutes. But first, let me tell you a little bit more about myself. So I've been involved in housing for a long time, and I've been involved with, I was legal director at the ACLU and worked closely with Phil, with Susan, with Barbara, and Dennis. We've tried to make some mischief with LDS. Julius Chambers was a good friend, and then Elaine Jones and Teddy. So there's been this community that's been working together, and all of us sort of learned some of our stuff from Alex Polikoff before we were grown. These are long, hard issues. Housing is sort of a hard issue. And I grew up in Detroit, and Detroit is actually a tough city. I'm actually having a conference there in April on bankruptcy and foreclosure. I think Dennis will be one of our speakers. The ACLU recently filed a case in Detroit looking at the subprime mortgages and the effect it has on 6,000 black black homeowners in Detroit. The effect actually is larger than that, and the judge actually talked about the effect of that in terms of bankruptcy in Detroit. And while Detroit's an extreme expression, you could actually think about that in terms of Baltimore, in terms of Philadelphia, and cities all over the country. So growing up in Detroit, I was one of the first children born in Detroit out of 9. I like to say I'm 6 of 9. And my family were sharecroppers in the South, like a lot of black families. They moved to Detroit for opportunity. That's why they moved there. They moved for a better life. And that's why people don't move for lightly. Moving is a pain in the butt. And people do it either because of some tragedy, or to be close to family, or some expression of opportunity. And so this case and this work around this is really about opportunity. Now, the families living in public housing in Boston and Baltimore were all headed by black women. And it's not coincidental that when we talk about extreme poverty and the location of extreme poverty, we're talking about race. It's getting to be less and less polite to talk about race in our society, but it's even less polite to consign large numbers of people, and certainly large numbers of blacks or any group, to the deep, profound isolation that this represents. So when my family moved to Detroit, moving to opportunity, moving to a city that was vibrant, moving to the arsenal of democracy, moving to a city that was, at the city level, if not at the neighborhood level, was well integrated, something happened. So now Detroit's 85% black, 60% of the population live below the poverty level, the first major city in the country to face bankruptcy. Is that coincidental? Are the racial dynamics one of the things we're looking at in terms of cities around the country? Because there are literally hundreds of cities facing bankruptcies. The vast majority of them are cities where the majority of people are not white. The vast majority of them. But almost no one's mentioned that. So I just want to lift up that these dynamics we're talking about are profoundly racialized. And if we don't understand that, then when you already heard about Saki's work in terms of Stuck in Place. 2 other books I'll throw out at you. One of them is by a colleague, Ian Haney Lopez, called Dog Whistle Politics. And another one by Robert Sampson called The Great American Cities. All of them talk about how central race is in terms of understanding this. And it's sort of hard to understand now because we have a president of the United States who's African American. We look at the Super Bowl, there are African Americans on stage. There's before the Super Bowl, for the real Super Bowl, between Seattle and And San Francisco, you had 2 black quarterbacks. You know, so something's happening. We are making progress. And yet, there are people who are stuck in place. And part of the debate that happens, that we get stuck in sometime, is it race, is it not race? In terms of understanding these dynamics, you cannot understand. There are very few in urban areas, there are very few poor whites that live in concentrated poverty, extreme poverty. And it's not just because black people come to Detroit and say, show me the neighborhood where they're failing schools, where the buses don't run, where they don't pick up the garbage, where it's not safe. So part of the thing to be clear about is that when we talk about segregation, we're not talking about separating people just from opportunities, from people of a different race. We're talking about the segregation of opportunity. We're talking about the distribution of life chances. And as you've already heard, when you put people, any people, it could be black people, white people, Latinos, because the early work on concentrated poverty came out of Europe, and these were white people. But when you consign people to a space where all of those factors come together, their life chances become greatly diminished, and the whole society suffers as a result of that. So that's not only the story of Detroit, it's the story of Baltimore. So I think it's important, as we sort of think about going forward, that we actually talk about the racial dynamics in this phenomenon. Now, I know some of you are here from health, some of you are here from education. Those of you who are familiar with my work know I talk about structures and systems. And one of the things that was interesting about Thompson, there were many things interesting about it, is that it refused to look at one indicator. And I felt some of the early expressions of moved opportunity were methodologically flawed because they looked too narrowly. Initially, we started looking at how to get people away from concentrated poverty without any attention to where they land. So if you look at the big study that the federal government did, it paid, and I talked to people at the very beginning of the framing of that study, not enough attention was paid to where people would land. So 70% of the students in the long study that the government did, 70% stayed in the same school district, and then actually ended up migrating back to their old neighborhood, which was not the case in the case that Alex brought in Gautreaux, where people moved 25 miles outside of the school district. That wasn't scientific. You know, Alex, what you did wasn't scientific. It just worked. And it reminds me of that old joke where a community group is working with some researchers, and they're trying to come up with a way of dealing with some of these hard issues. And they finally come up with something, and they go to the researchers and say, look at this, what do you think about this? And the researcher says, well, I think it works in practice, we're just not sure it'll work in theory. And I say that especially for people who, what you see here in Baltimore is working in practice. It doesn't mean we need to stop evaluating. It doesn't mean we can't learn more. But to build on what's already here. And I want to applaud, like Susan, the funders who've been involved in this for the long run. But also know that as you get to implementation, it's less sexy. You know, and so it becomes harder to fund at the very point that we're saying it works. Let's actually change the lives of these families and children. That's not so sexy. You know, most foundations is like, we've been doing that for 2 years, now we're going to do something else. It doesn't matter what, the 2 years has actually built some momentum. So again, I want to especially applaud those of you who stuck with this for the long term. So to some extent, we were one of the organizations that framed the whole discussion and the methodology around opportunity-based housing. And I want to just say a little bit about that, and I'll see how I'm doing for time, because I don't think of these as mobility programs. And I've said for years that what we're talking about is not simply affordable housing. What we're talking about, not scattered site housing, what we're talking about is opportunity-based housing. We're talking about housing that's deliberately linked to opportunity, robustly defined. And again, at Thompson, we use 14 different indicators to describe opportunity. In some of the work we did in Chicago, we used 30 different indicators to actually define opportunity. What HUD has done, building on some of our work, and move to opportunity in the work that Phil and others have been involved in, they've actually started looking at multiple indicators. They've moved away from just talking about race or just talking about income. We know all those things matter. And what we were able to do was basically not only say they matter, but to map them out, to create maps to show where opportunity is distributed. Now sometimes it's like a map is like a picture, right? You know, it's like someone takes a picture and you say, can you take another one? I don't like the way it looks. And after the third picture, you realize maybe it's not the picture. Right? So sometimes we don't like the way these maps come out, and they can certainly be fixed and improved. But part of the thing, they show us something we don't want to see. They show us extreme racialized opportunity. And they actually give a prescription of telling you a large number of people in those places, not because of their family circumstances, not because of the culture of poverty, but because of where they're located, their lives are going to be truncated. That if you take those same people and put them in high opportunity, their lives start to change. And if you add a little bit more, some support, some counseling, they change even more. So it's a structure. We're actually structuring people to fail. We're structuring people to have truncated lives. We're structuring people to have a different structure within the brain. And we're doing it on racial terms. And so I guess I just want to just say in my last few comments in terms of going forward. I think it's wonderful that in terms of affirmatively furthering fair housing, HUD is sort of built on this work. I think it's wonderful that there are more programs around the country, certainly the work coming out of Texas. I guess I would say a couple of things though, and I've been part of some debates in the housing community for years, that from my perspective, it's not, as I said, mobility versus in place, it's opportunity. Where is there a robust opportunity that people should have access to? Now the program here in Baltimore, many of these programs are voluntary. So if people don't want to move, they don't have to move. If you look at the data in terms of what most poor black people, and we are largely talking about black people, not exclusively, they are less concerned about staying in a place than they are about safety. Middle-class blacks are more concerned about place, oftentimes because they have already moved away from the place. And so they have a nostalgia about, why can't I stay in my neighborhood? It's like, well, why didn't you stay in your neighborhood? You know, and I mean, I live in San Francisco right now, one of the most expensive cities in the country, and I'm getting ready to move up to Oakland. And I feel I do it with a great deal of ambivalence, because I travel a lot. I come home late at night. I was mugged a few years ago in Ohio. San Francisco is an extremely safe city. Oakland's not. San Francisco has very few black people. It's a diverse city. There's no racial majority, but the black population is 5% and declining. It was 5% when I left. By the time I get back, it'll be 4. And what we're actually seeing is a restructuring of space and a racialization of space in one of the most progressive parts of the country, where people think that we're all beyond race because we have friends of different races. We go out and eat. I eat Mexican food. I eat Italian food. Heck, I even eat German food. But these structures have not been dismantled. And so part of it is to really look at the structure. And what we're seeing is the restructuring of opportunity. So in San Francisco, there is, in some fashion, extreme opportunity. Detroit got its first Whole Foods. Now I'm not saying Whole Foods is all that, but it's an indication of something. Detroit got its first Whole Foods. San Francisco has a Whole Foods everywhere in the city within 1 mile. Detroit's 3 times larger than San Francisco. They got their first one and they're celebrating. You can't go a mile without bumping into Whole Foods in San Francisco. So what I'm suggesting is that opportunity is not in the suburbs in the Bay Area. Opportunity is in San Francisco. It's in Berkeley. Opportunity, sometimes in the suburbs, sometimes it's in the city. And again, I know the great work that people here have done around education. Think about schools. Think about jobs. Think about health. Think about transportation. Think about air. Think about crime. Think about all those things together. And for One way of thinking about that is that housing becomes the hub if you can connect it to those opportunities. And that's what this case is about to me. So it's about opportunity-based housing. And in Baltimore, when we first did the maps and first looked at it, because initially this case was about Baltimore City. When we first looked at it, we said the opportunity is not in Baltimore City. It needs to be a regional approach because that's where the opportunity is, not because we wanted people to move outside of Baltimore City. Now some people will say, but what about opportunity here? I say, great, bring it on. But in that long, tough fight to get opportunity here, people should have a choice. And I'll end just by saying this. So Robert Sampson actually, in his book, The Great American City, he talks about choice itself being a structure of neighborhood. Let me just repeat that. The choice itself, because a lot of social scientists say, you know, you're trying to have a random sample. You want to bleed out choice. You want to have people. He said, no, choice itself is both racialized and a function of neighborhood. And he shows that you put people in a certain neighborhood, you affect their choice. You affect the way they think about choice. So choice is not something that's just internal. It's actually reading the environment. So these things are complex. And you have Marjorie here to help you unpeel that complexity. And there'll be more and more complexity. But we know this works. And what we found is that once people began to make that choice, even a few, they communicate to their friends and their neighbors, and all of a sudden more people are making the choice because they are learning from each other. Before social scientists sort of peel out all the complexity, they're figuring stuff out. So-and-so is going to school and they don't have to worry about getting shot. Can my son go to that school too? Can my daughter go to that school? I looked at one program in Minneapolis. It was a program where they did a survey, and it was an opportunity, giving people an opportunity to move outside of the central city into the suburbs. And the result of the survey, about 90% of the people said they did not want to move to the suburbs, and almost all of them were Black and Latino. And the people were relieved, especially the suburbs. You know, it's like, let's help them stay where they're comfortable, where there are barbershops and where they're, where everybody looks like them. They're comfortable in that situation. So the folks asked me to do a survey to follow up on the first survey. And this is what we did in the second survey. We started the survey with two questions or two conditions. We said, do you want your child to go live in an environment that's safe with low crime? The answer, of course, everybody said yes, 100%. If that place is in the suburb, would you want to move to the suburb? Now 90% said yes. The same 90% who said no in the first survey said yes in the second survey. So there is some complexity. I'll just end by, again, thanking all of you who've done incredible work, for being good friends, and work not for ACLU or for LDF, but work for the people who are stuck in place and work for the American dream. Thank you.
So Dennis is going to moderate our discussion.
It's a real pleasure to be here. It's always a pleasure to hear John. I've heard him I don't know how many times, and he amazes me every time. And in large part it's because his ability to structure these broader problems, to make coherent a whole range of things that we all sense. I mean, we come at this and it impresses me hearing the people talk about who is in this room, the incredible number of disciplines that people are coming from, whether it's from health or doing education litigation or housing litigation or community organizing. And I think each of us works in our little silo, and each of us is frustrated because we realize the structural things that John is talking about. We realize the limitations of the work we're doing and how it's impossible to get a complete remedy because it doesn't take account of all the other structural things that affect what's happening to our clients or to the people in our organization or to our patients. And so it's exciting to hear John come and make that coherent and talk about the way that these things work together and about how there's a need to come up with a solution that finds a way to have everyone who's in this room work together to come up with a solution that will change people's lives. I don't mean to impose my view about what should happen now. Let me just throw out one possible thing and then invite people to discuss what John has started us on the discussion. I think everyone here understands the argument about structural discrimination, understands the way the different institutions and structures deny people opportunity. But I think to some extent we are swimming upstream when you look at the country as a whole. When you look at the increasing Westchester County, which fights back against having affordable housing required in the individual towns. When you hear about the Baton Rouge school system that seeks to secede from the poor black section. More and more there are people who are trying to isolate themselves from the poverty, who see the possibility of having poor students come into their suburban districts as a threat to the safety of their schools. And so the question that I have, that I hope we'll address over the coming day is how do we change the narrative? How do we change the narrative from one that says that people are poor because of some problem with them, because of some shortcoming, because so many other people have been successful, but these poor black people haven't. You know, maybe it's their culture. You know, they don't come from the proper immigrant culture that pushes perseverance and all of these things. But the blame is always on the people who are the ones who are suffering the most. So I hope that one of the things that we'll talk about here is how we, working together, create a narrative that counters the prevailing narrative in this country that the fault is because of the people who suffer themselves. But what I also want to do is to invite people to comment on John's comments and talk about how we can blend together all of the different disciplines and concerns that each of us represents here. Any comments? Any questions for John? Yeah.
I'm interested in your thoughts about, in terms of the moving from extreme concentration, the different impacts depending on at what point in a child's life that occurs, and if there's a sense of what's optimal in terms of maximizing the impact. In other words, there's something in terms of the development of the child we should be thinking about in the conversation.
Right. Well, that's a great question, and those of you who do work in terms of health and child development would know that we're finding out new stuff all the time, and some of it's intuitive and some of it's not intuitive. But there's a lot of brain development in uterus. So there's a whole field now called epigenetics, where they start looking at the way genes are actually, so there's a part of the medical science basically saying the gap between nature and nurture is breaking down because they're so interactive. They're communicating with each other at such an early stage. Here's one that I love. Children cry with an accent. So they're actually picking up stuff in uterus, and so a German child cries differently than a French child, which we didn't know until recently. So there's a lot of research, and it's not a clear break. We know that the first 2 years, 50% of your brain development happens in the first 2 years. A lot of stuff going on. Those first 2 years are critical. Also, we know that if you have four traumatic experiences by the time you're 10, it rewires the brain. So then the brain is hardwired to deal, so it's not just you're dealing with stuff, your brain is actually rewired. It doesn't mean you can't change it, but it takes a lot of effort because the brain, the structure of the brain, it's not an incident anymore, it's the physical structure of the brain for a child who has more than 4 traumatic experiences. I think by the time they're 8 or 10, the brain is being rewired. Low-income kids of color have an average of 11. So now we're having in schools, a lot of schools are dealing with having post-traumatic counselors coming to schools, because a lot of these kids actually are suffering from trauma. And it's not just Johnny or Sally can't sit still. They're actually dealing with something that's physiological. Schools don't have the resources to deal with this. So early childhood is important, as you know. Michael is one of the great thinkers in terms of putting this together in terms of Thompson, but now he's also has the responsibility of helping to run the Baltimore School District. So I think if you don't catch kids early, it becomes harder. This early childhood up until preschool, Head Starts program, some of those programs work really well. The rub is if you then put kids back into a high stress, high poverty, then that benefit goes away by and large. So you need to do stuff, but then you need to keep doing stuff. You can't do it some people say child needs to learn to read by the third grade, or then they are projected to fail. That's right. But they can fail after the third grade too. So early childhood is really important, but you can't stop there. There has to be support throughout. There's also research now coming out showing that children who are exposed to racial hostility, that they actually have a different structure to their chromosomes. They call it stuff. They have this tail on their chromosomes that other kids don't have. So it's just sort of fascinating. I mean, I find this stuff disturbing, but also fascinating. I would say, obviously, those first few years are really important. Getting a kid to school ready to learn, and also supported. Some of the work I've been doing is about belonging. One of the most important needs we have is the sense of belonging, a sense that this is a place that's safe and I belong here. And a lot of times we send a message to kids that they don't belong, that they're not safe. So I know that that's not a precise answer, Michael, but I would say clearly early childhood is really important, but you can't stop there. You have to keep the kids safe even and engaged beyond that.
I just sort of picking up on where you were a few minutes ago, wanted to ask about the relationship between the parents' situation and the children's, and what opportunity really means for parents, because I know there is some literature on where if parents are feeling economic strain and their children are exposed to violence, then they show really bad effects, right?
Sure.
But if their parents are not exposed to economic strain, they are doing better. In those same environments, the children are able to do better. And one of the things that worries me always when we focus on either moving or early childhood education or anything is we're acting like there's this mechanical treatment. And that's not the gist of your remarks, but it's an interest of mine. And I just wanted to see, because I think when we're looking at things that really promote health and development, we can't separate the generations. And I wondered what thoughts you had about that.
No, I agree with one serious caveat. For those in the back who may not have heard, it was basically saying we have to focus more on the parents, and there's obviously research showing that parents are doing better, children are likely to do better as well. So and that's right? Except, so take the work that Alex and others did in terms of moved opportunity in Chicago in 1966 and beyond. Same parents, same whatever, still poor, still black. These were black parents in Chicago, black women in Chicago. And all of a sudden, not always across the board, girls did better than boys, you start seeing improvements. So actually just focusing on the parents alone, I think can be a mistake, can be a dead end, and can feed into a narrative that's actually counterproductive. Because what we're saying is that we're not going to change. There was that brief experiment in our country where we said, okay, it's two-parent households that's the solution. We're going to force these black women to get married. It actually happened, right? I mean, now it seems like, did we really do that? It was a catastrophe. It really didn't work at all. And so what we're saying is, and this is Robert Sampson and others' work, neighborhoods matter. Not just parents, but neighborhoods matter. Same parents, same jobs, same education. There's still a neighborhood effect, independent of the family, or in addition to the family. Now, the reason that's important is that it's hard to change the family structure. And I'm not saying we shouldn't support the parent, help the parent learn to read if they don't read well, get them a good job. I completely buy that. But it's in some ways easier to change the neighborhood. And that's what this work has shown. So it's not one or the other, but what Dennis was saying, too often if we focus on the parents, we actually end up blaming the parents. And I literally had a mother come to me, having heard a talk I was giving about how important it is to read to your children early, to get their vocabularies, get their language skills in place. There's now research showing that kids learning a second language prepares them to learn math. So not only teach your kids English, teach them Chinese too. Well, this woman came up to me afterwards and she had tears in her eyes. She says, I've heard this before. I'd love to read to my kids. I don't know how to read. Will you teach me? She said to me, will you teach me how to read? And I said, I can't. I mean, I'm sure there are programs. I don't know if there are programs. But I said, I can't take that on. So one of the things that happens is that it's hard to be a poor child. It's hard to be a poor family. But it's hard also to be a poor child in a poor neighborhood. And what Sampson actually shows is that for many black families, there are contiguous neighborhoods that are also poor. And so the problem gets compounded many times over. And if we then turn and say, if you just made different choices as a parent, if you married somebody, if you stayed, then you'd be different. The neighborhood structure is something we impose on the family. And it's something we could do quite differently if we wanted to. So that's the point I'm trying to make. It's not that the family is unimportant. I think the family is quite important. And there's all kinds of studies on that in terms of resiliency. Resiliency, the greater your network, the more resilient you are. If you have an extended family, if you have uncles and aunts and cousins, and then if you have neighbors. And what we see in these highly extreme poverty neighborhoods is the whole neighborhood is suffering. So the child doesn't get any relief. And so we have these whole things about safe pathways to school. How do you walk to school? And in East Oakland, they had a young man who had been shot or killed, and the principal said, how many kids, and these were elementary kids, 5th and 6th graders, how many of you have known somebody to get shot? Virtually every kid had known someone to be shot. That's not the family. That's something else going on. So again, I wouldn't say don't do the family, but we have less control over the family. When the whole family does change, I mean, the mother, and these usually our mothers, are more likely to work. They're less likely to, I mean, a whole bunch of things. Even their weight changes. So yes, it does affect not just the children, but also the family, or the mother in most cases.
Question whether we actually need structural remedies. I think looking at the failures of juvenile justice programs to actually respond to the harm, like all of the things that we're talking, trauma exposure, well documented as a sort of as a precursor to subsequent involvement with the juvenile justice system. And it's such a common refrain for caseworkers and everybody to say, I need to get my kid out of the neighborhood. I need to, and you know, there are all these sort of very intensive programs that are sort of brought down onto the families and the individuals in an effort to sort of save these children. And I think there's this constant sense in which these are structural issues. And so I just hope that is also part of this conversation. I think that there's a lot that you can pull from there.
Well, no, I think that's right. Although, again, I think it's complex. So two things. So to me, there's nothing wrong with saving children, right? So the question is, I think there's surveys and there's surveys, but if parents are living with children in a highly stressed, dangerous area, they want out. So it's not simply us coming in saying, you know, we're going to take you out. And that's what I start off with saying. I'm talking about opportunity. So if we can quote unquote clean up the neighborhood, that's fine. But my friend Lori Villarosa is sitting in the back. My father is 93 years old. I grew up in Detroit. And for those of you who watched the movie Race the Power of Illusion, you see the house I grew up in with my 8 brothers and sisters. My mother died years ago, and my father's legally blind. My sister lives with him. The last several years, he lives on a block where there's 4 functioning houses on the block. They can't shovel the snow because you shovel one, you have to shovel the whole block. And the houses that are not functioning, 2 houses down the street, there probably is a meth lab, another house they're raising pit bulls. Worse, my dad felt like he was in prison. Because when you leave the house, literally people would steal the awning. They know that my dad is old and blind. I did some work with the Senior Citizens of America and trying to get African Americans to exercise more, and they talk about walk around the block. I say, are you kidding? You don't walk around the block without a gun. Literally, the fire department, this is in Detroit, and I'm not knocking Detroit, I love the city, but when the fire department comes to put out a fire, goes in to check out what's going on in the house, they come back out, their equipment's been stolen off the truck. So I went to my father about 4 years ago and I said, Dad, this doesn't look good. Do you want to move? And years ago, he would say, I can't move because my doctor's here, all the kids are here, I'm the only one that really left. All the kids have left, but his doctor has left. The grocery store has left. He's there now by himself with the guy raising pit bulls and making meth. And he'd been in the house for over 55 years. And he and my sister, they're very Christian, and he said they prayed on it and they cried. It's the house that my mother had lived in until she passed. He said, we're going to do it. Well, first he said, I can't do it because I can't afford it. I said, I'll make it affordable. I'll do the finance. So, the idea of someone moving close to 90 to a new location, and for him, if you were in the house and you saw him, you wouldn't realize he's blind because he knows the house, right? He walks around. We say to all of our nieces and nephews, don't move anything because Grandpa really can't see, but he knows where everything's supposed to be. And if you move, he hurt himself. So it was a major trauma in a sense for him to even think about moving, but he took it. So what I'm saying is that the stresses that in extreme poverty is just so real, and people do want out, and if they want out of the extreme poverty. Now, if they can get out of the extreme poverty and stay in their house, they would have preferred. But for years, he's been waiting for Detroit to turn around. And some of my friends who are in housing saying, "You're selling out. You're moving your dad out of the city into the suburbs."
I think I'm just suggesting that this could be a remedy for kids in the juvenile justice system as well.
Yeah. And I mean, the one thing, I mean, I got a call from Seattle. I was telling Lori earlier today, asked me to help them with this thing about why put them in the juvenile justice system, right? I mean, even the disparity in terms of putting kids there. There's actually a nice story in Seattle where they're talking about black kids being over-criminalized and white kids not. And unfortunately, the black parents are complaining, the white parents aren't listening. And this white mother gets up and she says, I have a biracial family. If my black kids do something, they get suspended or sent to the police. If my white kids do the same thing, they get a talking to. And she says, it's the same family. And she said, at that point, everyone listened, right? So it's a white woman speaking but when the black families like, oh yeah, it was in this point. It's like the reason they get sent to the juvenile justice home is because they're dangerous, So there's a lot of things, and we can certainly make it better. But I guess I want to really make this point: don't make the best the enemy of the good, right? Yeah, you can tweak. You should tweak this program, Barbara. I don't know what you've been doing the last 30 years, but you should make it better. You should make it the best, and probably is the best right now. But as we make it better, here's something we know is working, and there are 20 other things we can and should do. But don't not continue to support this, we're still waiting for Detroit to stop losing population. We're still waiting for Baltimore to turn around. And I'm going to Detroit in 2 months, and all of you are invited, April 7th and 8th, to come to this conference to try to get real investment in Detroit. But in the meantime, I have no qualms that my dad lives in the suburbs.
I wanted to actually piggyback real quick, if I could, on what she said. I think this notion that I get upset because I feel like a lot of the programs that we have, even in Baltimore, that are targeted at African American communities are very paternalistic. They're sort of condescending. They don't really speak to all of the assets that the parents and families have because they're thriving and they're surviving in the face of so much risk and so much harm. And so what I really like about this is that it's a program, but it really seems more like a policy, and the profound impact that where you live makes on your health and well-being. I'm a substance abuse researcher. I'm one of the, maybe not in theory people. But I originally, how I really got involved in sort of teasing out the impact of the environment is the National Institute of Health funded this very large trial to understand the impact of crack cocaine exposure on children's development. And there were a whole group of researchers all across the U.S., multi-site trial, and they developed all of these programs targeted to the moms and the kids, you know, because they're born and they don't hit their developmental milestones. Lo and behold, there were no program effects. Again, we tried to program our way out of it, it didn't work. Then I said, well, let's see if we can sort of figure out why it didn't work. And we found this interesting result that the #1 predictor of the kids hitting their developmental milestones was maternal depression. So I said, I need to understand that. So I'm going to go and interview some of the moms myself, just in sort of a qualitative conversational interview. And when I went to their houses, I was like, oh my God, all the depressed moms live in really bad neighborhoods, and the non-depressed moms live in slightly better neighborhoods. And so what I found was that the moms in the segregated, high violence neighborhoods had a sense of helplessness and hopelessness and confinement. But they've got arms and legs at work. They're not lazy people. They're not wanting every parent wants the best for their children, but being confined and not actually having access to a way out or a way to a better community for your kid. It's like the two go together. So you've got parents who want what all parents want for their kids, but don't have ready access to it. So I really want to underscore, I hope that this is something that actually becomes a systematic opportunity that gets availed to people and not just another program. Because like you said, if we then take it away, those people will be back. And I think that's actually worse, having access and then being put back in a position of helplessness.
Thank you.
So I just wanted to go back to what you were talking about in terms of efforts and feasibility and communicating around all of these issues, because it took effort, a fair amount of effort, right, for these structures to be put in place. But it's taking all of us, 10, 100 times more effort to change them. And so the more we can, I think, communicate about the feasibility of these things. Like I remember the exact place I was in my apartment when Doug Massey was on WNYC and talked about the new book, the Mount Laurel case, and how everything worked. Like it was done quietly. This is fantastic evidence that not only did the people who moved do better, right, but the community did not suffer in any way the way everyone feared. And so how can we better communicate all of this to people? And at the same time, because one of the, even though I, very strongly embrace making health arguments and really showing what effects extreme isolated poverty has on mothers, children, fathers, all human beings in general, I worry about the sort of determinism that might come with that. And I'm just wondering what you think about how we can proactively sort of make sure that argument doesn't get taken too far.
So
and show how that we really can do this, because I know that that's one of the things that Barbara would really like to emphasize.
So Charles started off talking about, I think it was Charles, maybe it was Phil, talked about Westchester County. So what we haven't talked about, and this is a hard discussion, but showing something works doesn't mean it's going to be adopted. George Romney, when he was the Secretary of HUD, he said, if we're going to fix America, we need to open up the suburbs. And Nixon said, not on my watch. And there was no, well, show me a study that this is going to happen. What we did, we basically, we gave the white middle class a veto. The way housing is structured, the way in our society is that you have to get, it's like, so now I have to have a study, you have to go out to the suburbs to basically white folks who, in many cases in Detroit, moved out there because they didn't want to be around black folks. And you say, there's a study saying they'll do better if they become your neighbor, right? And you won't suffer. It's like, I know I won't suffer because they ain't moving here. So part of what we haven't discussed, and this was in the Kerner Commission report, when they talked about the black community understands that segregation is imposed on them by the white community, for the white community. Now that's changing some, but not as much as we'd like. But we still have this structure where, whether it's with tax credits or whether it's like, let's try to convince these, the further out you go, the wider the area. And so these people are making conscious choices. Interesting thing, if you look at the Tea Party, and I don't mean to just beat up on the Tea Party, but the country is becoming increasingly diverse, where the Tea Party is becoming increasingly white. Now the dynamics are such that somebody's making the choice, because you gotta, to try to find an all-white neighborhood today, you gotta work at it, But once you work at it and get it, and these structures support it. So I think it's a much larger discussion. And this discussion that I remember when the first effort to do some of this here in Baltimore, there was a video. It was like watching Mississippi burning. I mean, these white folks would come out in droves. They were having a meeting. They had to change the meeting because you know how you have these community meetings and nobody comes? Well, this meeting, too many people came. The fire marshal had to close it down. And I mean, these white people saying, let them stay in their own neighborhood. Now, again, I don't think a study would have helped those folks. Right? I'm not saying we shouldn't do studies, but I'm just saying there are all these complexities, and we have to deal with multiple things. Now we got beyond that, and through the hard work of ACLU and Susan and Barbara and others, we've gotten beyond that here in Baltimore. I think we've had some successes. So understanding how we did that would actually be quite important, because we have these same fights over and over and over and over again, whether it's Dorchester County, whether it's Louisiana, whether it's California. We still have these fights over and over again.
Well, we will have a chance to continue this discussion over the next day, but we do have to move on to the next speaker. But join me, please, in thanking John.